Hello, my name is Michael Sandel. Welcome to The Global Philosopher. In Brazil, Mateus.
To blame the rich countries for global warming when we didn't even knew about the consequences during the Industrial Revolution seems to be immoral.
I don't think you can expect those relatively poor countries to pay for climate change.
Alfred, in the US.
The market mechanism actually might get in the way of a more permanent long-term goal, because our long-term goal is to be able to live a life where we're free from using so much carbon. But what the market does, and we see it right now, is that it squanders resources and ingenuity in the wrong way.
I'm standing in a studio in Boston in front of a wall of video screens with 60 participants from 30 countries around the world. Our topic is climate change. Our question is, who should pay for it? I would like to hear from some of our participants who have first-hand knowledge of the effects of climate change. In the Maldives, Shauna.
What we are seeing currently is the impacts of erosion, the impacts of severe storms have intensified. We have variability in our rain patterns. It is affecting our fisheries. It is affecting our coral reefs. As you must know, this year is an intense El Nino year, and over 60% of our coral reefs have already been bleached. And this is going to have a significant impact on our sources of income, such as fisheries, agriculture, as well as tourism industry. So it is a slow death, and it is a death by 1,000 cuts.
Great, thank you for that. And Carla is from a coastal city in Peru. What effects have you observed?
So I'm from Piura, which is a coastal city in Peru at the north, just next to Ecuador. For example, Peru has 77% of the tropical glaciers in the entire world, but since 1970, 1/3 of the surface area of those glaciers has been lost because of global warming. But it's affecting especially poor people. Water gets most expensive, therefore they don't have money to afford it. But at the same time, I would like to raise an issue that is something that we are not thinking about it, that refugees is a problem that also will come from climate change, because people will have to go to urban areas, people will have to go to other countries, and that's already happening in certain areas in Peru.
Thank you for that. So Carla raises the prospect of what you might call climate change refugees. And that raises the question of who is responsible for helping them. In Zimbabwe, Jeremiah, what effects of climate change have you observed?
Oh, thank you very much. Our economy is based on agriculture. We have realized that our annual precipitation is a good link with the level of GDP in terms of productivity in terms of the country. So having erratic and unpredictable rainfall patterns, it means our agriculture is affected, thereby also affecting our economy, our GDP, and all other these related sectors. We've experienced a lot of heat waves of late. Also the current drought that is there also fueled by the El Nino phenomenon. And also in terms of the energy sector, one of our biggest hydroelectric power generation plants at the Kariba Dam, we have seen the levels dropping down to as low as 40% because of the reduction of rainfall and also increase in temperatures.
We've heard about some of the immediate effects of climate change, and yet the countries we've heard from are not the countries that are the primary contributors to carbon emissions. The Maldives, Zimbabwe, Peru, these are not the places who are sending the most carbon into the sky. So the question arises, who should bear the cost? Who should bear the burden of addressing climate change? Now, one way of thinking about this would be to say, well, let's first figure out what countries are currently emitting the most carbon and begin with them. What country today is the greatest global emitter of carbon? Actually, today in total emissions, China is first, the US is second, the EU is third, and India is fourth. So if we simply say the countries emitting the most today should bear the greatest burden, that's the list. But in global climate negotiations, not everyone agrees that that's the right way to think about who should bear the primary burden. Because if you look at the historic cumulative contribution of countries to carbon emissions, the list is rather different. Since the Industrial Revolution, the United States and Europe together have emitted over half of the carbon. And if you add Japan and Russia and Canada, those 5 countries have emitted about 2/3 of the carbon cumulatively since the Industrial Revolution. So some argue that the rich countries have used up a good part of the carbon space, and so they, the historically greatest contributors to emissions, should bear primary responsibility. I'd like to see what you think about this, and I would like to put it in the form of a poll question. So I'm going to ask you to consider the following argument. The argument is this: the rich countries are responsible for most of the carbon that has been spewed into the heavens since the Industrial Revolution. In becoming rich, they used up most of the planet's carbon space or carbon budget. So it's only fair that they, the rich countries, not today's developing countries, bear the primary burden of reducing global emissions. Let's take a poll. How many agree with that statement and how many disagree? 61% agree, 39% disagree. I'd like to begin with someone who disagrees with that argument. Let's hear from Mary in Calgary, Canada.
I think the problem with framing it as rich countries versus poor countries or West versus East or anything like that is that you're kind of creating dichotomies and automatically you're pitting countries against each other, which I don't think is beneficial. And I think one of the major things that it ignores is who are the largest emitters. Those are companies, those are corporations, those are not countries. So I think a carbon tax that applies more to corporations rather than the idea of countries is the way that we should be framing the argument.
Okay, thank you for that. In Brazil, Mateus.
Well, I do believe there's some responsibility that they should actually contribute in some way, but not because of a historical argument. I think that the idea that to blame the rich countries for global warming when we didn't even knew about the consequences during the Industrial Revolution seems to be immoral. And I believe that if they have any responsibility, it should be for reasons like outsourcing all their production to China in modern days, but not because of something they did ages ago, and no one that is alive at that time is alive today, for example.
So Mateus thinks it makes a moral difference whether the pollution is emitted during a period in time when we know the damaging effects or not, and therefore Mateus would downplay the responsibility of those who emitted pollution back before we knew about climate change and global warming. In China, Elizabeth, what do you think?
Oh, hi. I think rich countries still should pay for climate change. I think just to be practical, only those rich countries can afford to pay. And the fundamental question here is not just finding out who to blame, but how to solve this problem. I don't think you can expect those relatively poor countries to pay for climate change.
All right, now let me ask you a question, Elizabeth. Do you consider China, for this purpose, a rich country or a developing country?
Developing country.
Victor in the US is laughing.
I think we're starting now to not group countries in just two groups. That when you look at whatever we mean by developing countries, we have emerging countries and least developed countries, and there's more nuance than just developed or non-developed, and so it's difficult. It's a tough question.
It is a tough question. Okay, in Bangalore, India, Anirudh.
I think it's wrong to blame China for the emissions or like polluting the planet as such, because the developed countries are consuming products that are made in China. You want an Apple iPhone, you want it for like $700. It's going to be $700 only if China pollutes its country to make it all the way to the United States. You want anything cheap, it has to be produced in China.
Okay, Anirudh has just made a very important point, which is in calculating contributions to carbon emissions, it's not enough simply to measure how many emissions, how many tons come from which country. If China is creating pollution in the course of creating goods that are sold to the developed world and consumed there, then that should be included in figuring out shares of contribution, Anirudh. That's the point, is it?
Yeah, exactly.
And so by that measure, China's lead in emissions would be somewhat less. And of course, per capita emissions may also matter in addition to total emissions. Aru in Delhi.
Yes, I just wanted to suggest the distinction of the global north and the global south, because I feel like it would clear up a lot of the discussions we're having about outsourcing, about whether corporations are responsible or people. Basically, with the global north being those, whether in developing countries or developed countries, who are the elite, because it's even in India, the elite of India are certainly consuming at a rate that's comparable to the elite of the U.S. And similarly, there are those in the U.S. who are part of the global south rather than the global north, despite being in a developed country.
Right, thank you for that. So Aru also gives us a reason to consider patterns of consumption rather than simply counting emissions from a given country. So we have, running through this argument seems to be the idea that the ability to pay, the capacity to contribute to remediation of climate change morally matters a lot. Now, I'd like to put to you a question about a mechanism that some rich countries say would make it easier and more cost-effective for them to reduce climate emissions: carbon trading or emissions trading. Now, recently, the countries of the world gathered in Paris and they made pledges to reduce its emissions. Under the agreement, a country can fulfill its pledge in one of two ways, either by reducing its own emissions or by paying to reduce emissions someplace else. Here's how it works. Suppose the US or Switzerland agrees to cut emissions by 25%, but it would be costly and politically difficult to cut back that much on their own air conditioning and driving habits. So they pay to reduce pollution somewhere else in a developing country. For example, they might pay India to replace highly polluting kerosene lamps and stoves with energy-efficient lighting and cooking devices. The reduced emissions from those Indian villages would count toward the US or the Swiss target. Some people say it's an efficient way of reducing global emissions at the lowest possible cost. Others say it makes pollution a luxury good and lets rich countries buy their way out of shared sacrifice. Here's the poll. Is global carbon trading ethical or unethical? Let's see what people think. 30% say it's ethical, 70% say unethical. So let's first hear from those who are in favor of carbon trading as a way of enabling countries to meet more ambitious targets for reductions. In Beijing, Ma.
Well, I think whatever scheme we may choose, as long as the scheme helps us to reduce overall carbon emissions and reduce overall pollution, then it should be considered ethical. And I think that the whole idea of carbon trading is based on this economic idea of marginal cost, which means that in some places there are lower hanging fruits. To reduce pollution further in a country like Denmark would be much more difficult than to reduce pollution from a country like China. So why don't we pay China to lower pollution first? I don't see why this is unethical.
As a matter of principle, Ma in Beijing says it's cost effective. Why not go for, as Ma puts it, the low-hanging fruit, the most cost-effective ways of reducing emissions, if that will have a good result? From Brazil, Henan.
Yeah, I have some strong concerns about this approach. In principle, I don't believe that the market and economics should deal with this and should allocate the best solutions for how we deal with pollution, how we deal with climate change. And the carbon trade idea coerces those countries that are not being free, but they actually don't have a choice. So I don't see this as freedom, I see this as coercion, and that's one of my main objections of this plan.
But where's the coercion? Take the hypothetical, where the US or Switzerland pays to replace all those polluting kerosene lamps and stoves in India. India is better off, its development is served, and the rich country can count those emissions reductions toward its own target. Where's the coercion in that? In Calcutta, India, Beth, what do you think?
Yes, hello. What I basically think is that the main goal here is to basically mitigate the effects of climate change. And well, you actually mentioned a very pressing issue about the kerosene lamps and stoves, which is actually a very big issue out here, not just in the villages, but in the cities as well. I live in Calcutta, and there are no dearth of these out here either. So if the US or a rich country for that matter helps us out and actually helps us to replace these kerosene stoves and lamps with something more energy efficient and cost efficient, I don't see where the problem is.
Well, let's put Beth and Henan together on the screen and see if, Henan, you can reply to Beth's argument.
Yeah, it's a very complicated issue, right? And I think that's like not even efficient, but that's not like just, that's not ethical at all. But I strongly believe that like putting a price on such a complicated issue actually deviates the focus on how to solve it and just accumulate the problem. Okay,
Beth, it commodifies, it puts a price on carbon emissions, and it's coercive. What do you say to Henan?
Well, I certainly do not believe there is anything coercive about this. But that said, there are certain things you have to bypass. There are certain things you have to do if you need to, attain a certain goal. And global carbon trading is not the actual one solution, but it is a very good solution.
Go ahead.
When you say this, it's really focused on like a short-term goals of one side. It's actually thinking like a very short-term like mentality. And when you think of the big picture, we're not like helping each other at all. Like when you think about like fairness means like everyone has the duty to help with this, to understand that like if we don't reduce our emissions in a global perspective, we're gonna go in the wrong direction.
Let's turn now. We've got a number of people who are observing this discussion live online, and Dave at the BBC has been receiving their responses to this debate. Dave, what have we heard?
Yeah, so we're getting lots of interest from people watching from around the world. Let me just read out a couple of comments. Joe says that carbon trading is a complete distraction and what's important is that we change the way we live our lives. And Mitra from the United States says that the proposed taxes on countries or the carbon offsetting for emissions is like committing a sin and then paying alms to the religious leader and asking for forgiveness.
All right, let's take up that last analogy. Some compare tradable carbon permits to buying indulgences. Back in medieval days, there were those who sinned, who paid a certain amount to the church in hopes or the expectation that that monetary payment, the purchase of an indulgence, as they were called, would offset their transgressions, buying salvation. Don in the Netherlands, would you like to reply to this analogy between tradable emission permits, global carbon trading, and the buying of salvation in medieval days? Do you think that's morally an apt analogy?
No, I don't think so. I think the buying of salvation is about forgiveness, and the buying of emission rights or global carbon trading is about results. So I think you can be more pragmatic when it comes to the climate, because it's in all our interest that the climate change is stopped. So I think the result is more important.
So Don says the principal distinction between global carbon trading and buying indulgences for or salvation is that pragmatism and efficiency are appropriate in the case of reducing carbon emissions, but not in these other areas. Who disagrees with Don? Who thinks that it is a good analogy and can reply to Don's argument? Hazel in Hong Kong.
Yeah, I think that one thing that's missing from this debate is that it's very framed around like who can buy, who can sell, and do we have like an inherent right to exploit the earth? Is that really the attitude that we want to have towards our behavior and how it impacts on the planet? Do we want our relationship with the earth to be reduced to how much we can exploit it and how much we can bounce back from it?
Okay, so back to Don, and let's put both Don and Hazel on the screen. Hazel has a pretty good counter-argument, doesn't she? She says it's not only results in terms of tonnage of carbon emissions that matter. It's cultivating the right kind of attitudes toward nature, toward the planet. Do I have it right, Hazel?
Yeah.
What do you say to that, Don?
Yes, I'm sensitive to that argument because it's also about a good attitude we have to create. But in the meantime, we have, well, say, a certain amount of euros, and we have to put them on the place where we can do best for the climate, I think. And is it in China? It will be in China.
What about that, Hazel?
I think, like, yeah, while I see where that's coming from, we do have a limited amount of things that we can use to help fix the problem. I think it would be more like, I don't like using the word, but more cost effective if we focused on reducing our consumptions, because that way we can also make a tangible change that doesn't necessitate like spending more money or buying more new technology.
So you're saying it's not only the results that matter, but the attitude, the spirit in which those actions are undertaken.
Definitely.
Don?
Can't we do both?
You know, this question of attitudes, not only results, but attitudes matter, reminds me of a website set up by some critics of carbon trading. They offer the opportunity to offset infidelity. So that, for example, if someone is married and cheats on his or her spouse, it's possible to go online and pay someone in another city to be faithful. Yeah, and the website, Don, it's called cheatneutral.com.
It's a very good idea, but I don't think it's working in personal relationships.
Okay, but the issue here, and we're coming to really the heart of the philosophical question, the issue here is whether global cooperation to reduce carbon emission is akin to cultivating personal relationships, or whether it's more like a business transaction. So we need now to hear from a defender of carbon trading against the two analogies that we've been discussing. Some say it's like buying offsets for infidelity or for sin. But Ma from Beijing, you defended the market view of this. What do you say to those analogies?
Yes, I think if we talk about attitude and trying to install the right attitude towards climate change, the best way to do that is through pricing, right? If you put a price tag on carbon, then everybody get the awareness that this is something that you cannot do for free. When two parties trade carbon, it's not that the party paying for the offset is not doing anything. It's actually paying a price which is not cheap, basically, and it can be seen as a penalty for the kind of emissions that you otherwise will create, while the other party is delivering the kind of results. So I wouldn't use the salvation kind of analogy, and I do think that in our generation, the biggest salvation is actually stop climate change together, and to do it as soon as possible is the biggest moral responsibility of our generation.
Alfred, in the US, what do you say?
So I think the market mechanism actually might get in the way of a more permanent long-term goal, because our long-term goal is to be able to live a life where we're free from using so much carbon. But what the market does, and we see it right now, is that it squanders resources and ingenuity in the wrong way. We create vast bureaucracies to monitor, register, certify, validate, enforce millions of emissions cuts. Thousands of bright technical people go to working, inventing ways of achieving these cuts as cheaply as possible. Wall Street tries to profit from speculation and market making. And once we have such a big market just centered around cutting down and making it cheap for wealthy nations or corporations to buy carbon permits, that it gets in the way of not using such sources at all. Because you need that source to make money from it, and when there's a strong market, I think it gets in the way of a permanent solution of not using so much fossil fuel.
Let's turn to Dave at the BBC to hear what people are making who are watching online, what people are making of this argument.
Quite a few more analogies between carbon offsetting and forgiveness and sins. James from America says carbon needs to be kept out of the environment, not paid for. The sin can't be spread around, it must be stopped. Yogendra from India says fines of any kind absolve moral responsibility. I'm not sure whether she's being tongue-in-cheek.
I see. Well, we've identified, I think, the heart of the philosophical disagreement here in the debate about carbon trading. There are those who point to the economic benefits. We've heard the argument that it's cost effective. And given the pressing importance of reducing emissions, we need to use all the mechanisms at our disposal. And against this argument, we've heard from those who say, yes, but there is something corrupting to attitudes if rich countries can, in effect, buy their way out of more demanding reductions in their own emissions. What about the attitudes of solidarity that need to be cultivated to generate future cooperation on climate change? But what we've not quite yet examined is what attitudes exactly are eroded or damaged by the use of a market mechanism in carbon trading. There is one powerful answer that has recently been offered by Pope Francis in his recent encyclical on the environment. Here's how he put it. If we approach nature and the environment without an openness to awe and wonder, our attitude will be that of masters, consumers, ruthless exploiters unable to set limits on our immediate needs. And then he went on to write that environmental education is about more than policies and facts. It is, he thinks, a spiritual project that must, quote, strive to promote a new way of thinking about human beings and our relationship with nature. So here we have Pope Francis giving an instance of the argument about attitudes, and the attitudes he thinks are important and that he thinks are at stake in the debate about carbon trading are attitudes of hubris versus humility, of mastery and exploitation of nature as against awe and wonder and appreciation. Now, I'd like to hear what people think about this argument, but to make the question concrete, I would like to put to you the following hypothetical question. Suppose we discovered a technological fix to climate change that enabled us to continue our current patterns of consumption and energy use without damaging effects on the climate, the oceans, and the environment. Would this be an unqualified good, or would it be a mixed blessing, averting the threat of climate change, but removing the impetus to reform our consumerist ways and to rethink our relation to nature? Tell us, in reply to the poll, whether you would consider this technological fix an unqualified good or a mixed blessing. 36% say it would be an unqualified good, 64% a mixed blessing. Let's hear first from someone who thinks it would be an unqualified good. Mateus in Brazil.
The consumerist culture, the only problem with it is the impact on the environment. So if we can find a way to maintain this culture, but without actually damaging the environment, then there is absolutely nothing wrong with keeping up with the consumerist culture.
Okay, there's nothing wrong with a consumerist culture except for the harmful effects on the environment. So if we can remove those effects through a technological fix, we can perfectly well keep the consumerist culture we have. Why change it? That's Mateus' argument. Now, who disagrees with Mateus? In Wales, Marion, what do you say to Mateus?
In part, I agree with Mateus, but my point would actually be also that there are many different forms, again, of environmental degradation. So if we solve the problem with air pollution and carbon emissions, for example, would we be concerned about deforestation? So does a tree in itself have any value to us? For example, if we're not keeping trees to help us with matters such as air pollution. I do believe that there is more at stake than just environmental degradation. So we can't always have everything bigger, better, and faster, because there is a sense of individualism without respect for a community that we live within, which also encompasses the natural world that we are part of.
Are you suggesting, Marion, that an indifferent or even exploitive attitude toward nature somehow goes along with an indifferent and exploitative attitude toward other human beings or toward society?
Yeah, I think there's a tendency in human nature to try to value something about oneself above something about someone else. And consumerism actually exacerbates that kind of ugly side of human nature in a sense. I think you alter the quality of the people that deal in the trading. So the people that deal with these commodities, they also become valued through their dealings with these commodities.
We've just had a contribution from one of our viewers online in India who says, what about Gandhi's idea that we are trustees or stewards of nature, not the owners of nature? In Hong Kong, Ike.
I agree with that concept because it's the idea of irresponsible behavior and not recognizing impacts of your action in the long term. that has brought about climate change and had other impacts, like, for instance, exploiting children for work. You don't see that impact while I'm wearing this cap. I don't see that impact, so I don't feel guilty about it. It's these attitude, turning your blind eye to something you don't see immediately that has brought about climate change. So even if we do have a technological fix, problems are still going to exist, like exploitation of children, inequality, and not caring about things you don't see immediately.
In Dhaka, Bangladesh, Tamid.
Point is actually when we're trying to fix the environment, so we're thinking that we're the master of the world, and the consumer behavior actually allows us or encourages us actually to exploit more. That's why I said it's a mixed blessing, and we have to think about not only the environmental fix but also other, because this consumer behavior will actually keep us consume more or exploit more.
So Tamid, if I understand you, you're suggesting that what's objectionable about a consumerist way of living and being is that it goes along with an attitude of mastery, you said. Mastery toward what? Toward nature?
Towards nature, society. So I'm the god, and because we shouldn't act as a master in this universe. I don't know whether I'm making sense or not.
No, it's a powerful suggestion. So Tamid says that what's wrong with a consumerist way of living and being is that it embodies an attitude of mastery toward nature, a lack of humility, a kind of hubris, maybe, that he thinks is misplaced and that is, the wrong way to be, the wrong way to live, the wrong attitude to have toward the natural world. Is there someone who would like to address that way of thinking? In Peru, Kelly.
Hi, I completely agree with what has been said. I feel that being from Peru and being surrounded by indigenous people, I'm from the Andes, so I can say that the relationship that one establishes with Earth, it's very cultural. It's very different to what I experienced living in the Western Hemisphere. And I would also argue that it's definitely this disagreement on how we establish our relationship to Earth that is connected to how we disagree and how to solve the climate change issue. Indigenous peoples with eco-environmentalism minds disagree with with market systems because they want to see more of a universal solidarity on how to relate to Earth apart from the economic perspective.
Okay, so we've heard from Kelly and from Tamid a powerful statement, a critique of the attitudes associated with consumerism, the attitudes associated with wasteful, exploitative stances toward nature beyond the results. Who can reply to these arguments about attitudes of consumption being corrupting and inadequate to what it means to lead a good life? All right, Beth, in Calcutta.
There's an issue I would like to raise here. There's something saying that you can't go back, you can only go forward. So we can't just stop living our lives the way we do. Can we actually switch off the AC, switch off the lights, and go back to living in the candlelight and without electricity and everything? No, we certainly can't do that.
And in the UK, Ziji, you've argued for the pragmatic way of approaching climate change, and yet you've heard those who've said we also need to try to change consumerist, exploitative attitudes toward nature. What do you say to that argument?
I just don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong with the consumer nature. It is important to protect environment, yes, but if we can develop ourselves, if we can improve the living standard of our peers, why would you put environment superior to humanity? Why would you care more about the needs of environment over the needs of humanity?
In Kathmandu, Nepal, Srini.
Talking is very easy. We cannot hope the consumers of the United States to live the life of the people of Nepal. And I personally believe that climate change is like trading weapons. From one side, you're giving the weapons, and from the other side, you're asking for world peace. So people are really selfish, and I don't think people will be able to change their attitudes.
Well, given that the Earth is the only place we have to live, we're confronted with some some hard questions about how to deal with climate change. We've heard an important disagreement about whether we should be pragmatic in dealing with a very urgent, looming global problem and use whatever mechanisms, including market mechanisms, might help. And we've heard a competing argument that the challenge of climate change is partly to reduce emissions, but is also to use the challenge of climate change as an occasion to rethink consumerist and materialist ways of living. And we've heard the debate. We've not resolved it. But I think we can draw, well, at least one conclusion. We know that contending with climate change involves hard negotiations among countries. What we've seen today is that it also requires hard thinking about some big philosophical questions about the meaning of justice in a global setting. Questions about the tension between economic efficiency and global solidarity. Questions even about how we should understand our relation to nature and to the planet we share. These are questions that today we must think through together, very much as we've been doing here, in the company of people from different countries, from different cultures around the world. And so to our participants, to our listeners, to our viewers online, I want to thank you for joining me for this episode of The Global Philosopher. You did a great job.